Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. Today is February 18th, 2025, and our class tonight is going to be on the pamphlet that was put out by Nemmy Sparks, What is Socialism? As always, the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies is a Party of Communist USA-initiated school. We are not a direct party school, so this does allow us a wide range of topics and discussions. With that being said, tonight we'll be breaking down our class into four different sections. We will go over first attempts of socialism in the earlier part of the book. The second part will be going over what is socialism on America, and obtaining socialism. We will go into a further discussion of it with the quote on historical materialism by Engels and who owns what under socialism. And lastly, what could America do with socialism? So for our first section is called A Workers' Democracy, and General Secretary Joe, you have the floor.
All right. Background: Paris Commune. In 1870, the Prussian Empire laid siege to Paris during the Franco-Prussian War, a war for territories. In the fall of 1870, the Parisian workers established a National Guard and effectively defended Paris during the siege. It was during this chaos that the Paris Commune was born. One of the first decrees of the Commune was for the suppression of the old standing army to be replaced by the armed people. The Central Committee of the Commune issued their manifesto on March 18, 1871. The proletarians of Paris, amidst the failure and treasons of the ruling classes, have understood that the hour has struck for them to save the situation by taking into their own hands the direction of public affairs. They have understood that it is their imperious duty and their absolute right to render themselves masters of their own destiny by seizing upon the governmental power. The Commune was made up of municipal councillors from all of the cities of Paris's wards, chosen by universal suffrage. Their short terms could be revoked if the people were not satisfied. It was a working body with both legislative and executive powers. All officials, including the police, magistrates, and judges, were to be agents of the Commune and could be recalled at any time and were paid the same wages as workers. Housing rents were forgiven. The Catholic Church was severed from all privileges, including their control over the schools. The priests were to depend on alms from the faithful, and education was now free of charge. The Commune was strengthened by the formation of a women's union, spearheaded by women socialists. They demanded the right to take arms in the defense of the revolution. Other demands included divorce, the right to divorce, education, equal pay, and recognition of all children as legitimate. However, by May 1871, the Commune was crushed by the combined strength of both the Versailles government and its adversary, Prussia. After the Commune was crushed, Marx wrote that it had demonstrated the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. Once the capitalists had replaced the feudal lords and the class struggle between workers and capitalists heated up, the bourgeoisie now used state power mercilessly and ostentatiously as the national war engine of capital against labor.
Thank you, Comrade Joe. And with that, we'll break for our first round of discussion. Please use the raise hand function, and we will get to your hand or comment in the order that they go up.
Did they have women's suffrage and the universal suffrage?
They did. That's interesting. They did not say women's suffrage, but in the first slide, or one of the slides, it did say that all of the elections were done by universal suffrage. So I'm hoping that that is enough. It'd be hard to, yeah, and based on the rights that they wanted, they had to have the suffrage also, if you look at it.
All right.
I think what, I always take from the French Revolution and then the Paris Commune, what came after, the first French Revolution was before the Paris Commune, but is just like how almost like obsessed they were with like being scientific, like this is like where the metric system comes about. And I think to a degree where they wanted to make like time a metric, where they created clocks with like 10 hours instead of 12 hours to make it more scientific there. So that was the only thing that didn't actually hold. The rest did. And I find that really interesting. And as you see what they were doing for women's rights, definitely a progressive, a step in the right direction. And I think with if we think as historical materialists, what they were trying to accomplish, the first communist government, 70 days, it wasn't a success, but at least it was something pushing in the right direction. That's all.
Thank you, comrade.
According to the Library of Congress, the commune did have women's suffrage.
Thank you, comrade.
Yeah, I just always found it interesting that it was somewhat of an open question for Marx as well before the commune whether or not the proletarians could actually just lay hands on the state and take control of it and use it for their ends, and that it was I mean, amongst many other things, but I always thought it was interesting that afterward the idea is that now you have to, I think he says the word smash state power and replace it with the proletarian versions, which I know they look like or take similar shapes to what we have under capitalism. But yeah, I thought it was interesting that basically Marx seems to have always waited for historical data before he'd make a pronouncement like that.
Thank you, comrade. Yeah, it's quite fascinating. Marx, Engels, Lenin, different anarchist writers, many people wrote about this event. And going over all the different writings, it's quite fascinating, I think, to see what they each gained from this event, which really for its day was definitely earth-shaking, I would say. There had probably never been anything like it before. All right. Well, if there are no other hands or comments for this section, we will go on to the second section now. You have the floor, sir.
So what socialism is not? If capitalism could adapt production, not for the acquisition of profits, not in satisfying the whims of the parasitic classes, not in perfecting methods of exploitation, not in exporting capital, but instead for the systematic improvement of the material position of the workers and peasants, then there would be no crisis. But then again, capitalism would not be capitalism. In order to abolish crises, capitalism must be abolished. Stalin, 16th Party Congress. Above all, socialism is not a system of poverty. It is necessary to stress this fact because even certain supporters of American-Soviet friendship thought that they would allay capitalist fears of the socialist system in Russia by spreading the idea that socialism is all right in the Soviet Union because the czarist peasant never had anything anyway. And therefore, the uniform poverty of socialism is an improvement for the Russian masses who have never had a chance to learn the glorious standard of living of capitalism. Winston Churchill has also referred to the socialist system as a system for sharing the poverty. That this idea is false can be shown by a quotation from Stalin. Some people think that socialism can be consolidated by a certain equalization of people's materialist conditions based on a poor man's standard of living. That is not true. That is a petty bourgeois conception of socialism. In point of fact, socialism can succeed only on the basis of a high productivity of labor, higher than under capitalism, on the basis of abundance of products and of articles of consumption of all kinds, on the basis of a prosperous and cultured life for all members of society. Stalin, Leninism, page 367. What is socialism? Socialism is a planned system of economy where the means of production are owned by society as a whole. Nemmy Sparks. Socialism can succeed only on the basis of a high productivity of labor, higher than under capitalism. Stalin. The exploitation of man by man will become impossible because it will be possible to seize the means of production. Lenin in State of Revolution. The socialist system of economy and the socialist ownership of the means and instruments of production, firmly established as a result of the abolition of the capitalist system of economy, the abrogation of private ownership of the means and instruments of production, and the abolition and exploitation of man by man, constitute the economic foundation of the USSR. Article 4 of the Soviet Constitution. The right of citizens to personal ownership of their incomes from work and their savings, of their dwelling houses and subsidiary household economy, their household furniture, utensils, articles of personal use and convenience, as well as the right of inheritance of personal property of citizens, is protected by law. Article 10 of the Soviet Constitution. Is socialism un-American? Laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind, and as new discoveries are made, new truths are discovered. Institutions must advance also to keep pace with the times. We might as well require a man to still wear the coat which fitted him when a boy, as to require a civilized society to remain even under the regimen of the barbarous ancestors. Thomas Jefferson. The Constitution of the United States of America does not commit our nation to any particular economic system. Americans have always fought for a higher level of freedom and progress. Nemmy Sparks. Labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor and cannot exist without labor. Labor is the superior of capital and deserves much higher consideration. No man living are more worthy to be trusted than those who toil up from poverty. Let them beware of surrendering a political power which they already possess, and which, if surrendered, will surely be used to shut the door of advancement for such as they, and new disabilities and burdens will be fixed upon them until all their liberties are lost. Strategy. After the Paris Commune was crushed, Marx wrote that it had demonstrated the working class cannot simply lay hold of ready-made capitalist state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. Therefore, what needs to be done? Winning the majority of the working people to the realization that it is impossible to survive indefinitely with capitalism. Fight for the right to work for all citizens, regardless of gender, race, etc. Eliminate the unemployment reserve. Fight to unleash the innovative technology that capitalists suppress. Fight for the right to excellent free education to provide for our own economic needs.
Thank you, Comrade. With that, we'll break for our second discussion round. If you have a question or a comment, once again, please use the raise hand function. One note I would like to say is this was written in 1947. So anytime you hear someone say socialism's when no food, vuvuzela, iPhone, that's only been made for decades since, and it's nothing new. Comrade Angelo, you have the floor, Secretary Emeritus. Go ahead, sir.
I think what we just read now is very important. That should have been read in the beginning of our party, because the confusion of who is socialist and what is socialist is solved right here. None other by Comrade Stalin. He says it very clear. What is socialism and what is not socialism. He uses the word exploitation of one man over another. He is talking about economic exploitation. Am I incorrect on that? That's the basic exploitation. of one species over another species, exploiting them, using their labor power for your own economic advancement. With that definition, according to Stalin and Lenin, how can we, in all honesty, the word is honesty, and seriousness, call certain countries socialist if they're not? Think about that. You all know what I'm talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo.
Yeah, this is more for anyone listening in the future when this is up on YouTube. I want to emphasize, in case people don't know, the difference between personal property and private property. Personal property is things you intend to use yourself that you need in your everyday life. Your toothbrush, your bed, even land you use to garden yourself. Private property are things that are used to make money. Okay, we're not going to abolish personal property. We're going to abolish private property. Thank you.
We'll actually be talking about your toothbrush later, so very good point.
What Angelo said reminded me about what the last General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam said before he died in 2019 or something. He said something along the lines of, in Vietnam, we don't have socialism or capitalism. We have something magical and new. It was the most ridiculous thing. He's like, just playing with words the whole time. He's just revisionism. He's like, we need new economic policy because we're so poor. But I've seen their steel production. They're plenty industrialized. It's so ridiculous. He's like, whatever. I don't know.
Thank you, Comrade. I think you're referring to, I think that was Nguyen Phan Trong, I believe. We'll go on to our next section. Comrade, can I have you read section number 3 for us, please?
Okay, will do. Section 3, historical materialism. Who owns what under socialism? Okay, socialism and its place in history, and this is from Engels. Anarchy in social production will be replaced by systematic, definite organization. The struggle for individual existence will disappear. For the first time, man, in a certain sense, is finally marked off from the rest of the animal kingdom, emerging from mere animal conditions of existence into real human ones. The whole sphere of the conditions of life which environ man and which have hitherto ruled man now comes under the dominion and control of man, who for the first time becomes the real conscious lord of nature, because he has now become master of his own social organization. Man's own social organization, hitherto confronting him as a necessity imposed by nature and history, now becomes the result of his own free action. Only then will man himself, more and more consciously, will make his own history. Only from that time will his social causes set in movement by him have, in the main, and in a constantly growing measure, become the results intended by him. It is the ascent of man from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. Okay, who owns what under socialism? To understand and give the people the full benefit of that example, we also have to clarify some misconceptions that are deliberately and calculatedly spread by the capitalist press. The socialist state, for example, which has the role of protecting the achievements of socialism against fascist capitalist reaction, is not some cold, cruel materialist instrument riding roughshod over the individual, but is instead the instrument of the people themselves. To quote from the Article 1 of the Soviet Constitution, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is a socialist state of workers and peasants. And Article 3 makes it plain. In the USSR, all power belongs to the working people of town and country, as represented by the Soviets of Working People's Deputies. This is democracy in the highest sense. Article 4 clearly explains that the economic system of the Soviet Union is socialism. The socialist system of economy and the socialist ownership of the means of instruments of production firmly established as a result of the abolition of the capitalist system of economy, the abrogation of private ownership of the means of and instruments of production, and the abolition of the exploitation of man by man, constitute the economic foundation of the USSR. Who owns the means of production? To quote Article 6, the land, its natural deposits, waters, forests, mills, factories, mines, rail, water, and air transport, banks, posts, telegraph, and telephones, large state-organized agricultural enterprises, i.e. state farms, machine and tractor stations, and the like, as well as municipal enterprises in the bulk of the dwelling houses in the cities and industrial localities are state property. That is, belong to the whole people. Another frequent slander about socialism in the Soviet Union is that there is no private property, and therefore the government can come into your home and make you share your toothbrush or take away your favorite necktie or something like that. Article 10 shows plainly the broad rights of citizens to private property, even including inheritance. Okay, the right of citizens to personal ownership of their incomes from work and of their savings, of their dwelling houses and subsidiary household economy, their household furniture and utensils, as well as the right of inheritance of personal property of citizens is protected by law. The only things that cannot be privately owned are society's means of production.
Thank you, comrade. And with that, we'll stop for another round of discussion and comments. So please use the raise hand function if you have a question or a comment. Secretary Emeritus Angelo, go ahead.
Yeah, I hope that we're listening to this clearly. This is the definition of socialism that I learned when I was in the old CP. This is what I saw in the Soviet Union when I lived in the Soviet Union. This is socialism. All the means of production, all are owned in common. Not just some. Not just some are owned by the government and some are owned by individuals. No, all the means of production. So when you hire somebody in a capitalist environment, you are giving them money, but you're not paying them their entire labor power. That we discussed already when we went into economics. So therefore, it's understandable that in a country that calls themselves a socialist republic, there cannot be individuals owning factories and hiring other workers. That's just a fact of life. Unfortunately, some people try to change that. They try to revise it. They become, in effect, a form of revisionist. Think about that. They're not revisionists from the left, they're revisionists from the right. And they try to revise and change what the original thing in order to fulfill their present situation. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade Angelo.
This is a separate question of my own. This is a little bit more into the philosophy of the whole situation, but when it comes to socialist, the actual economic mode of production, when it comes to mankind's and specifically the working class being a product of its environment, fundamentally, technically, free will doesn't exist. We are all just essentially acting out based off of what our environment is in our material conditions. Now, I've heard other perspectives in the communist movement that man can supersede his environment entirely and be a master of his environment to extend his own creative will to his environment fundamentally. So I'm wondering what was the Soviet interpretation of free will and whether or not man can supersede his material conditions entirely. That's all.
That's a fantastic question.
I think the point at which we basically control every aspect of not only society but the environment, I think at only that point in time would that be true, where we basically can create our own. What was the phrasing you used?
Material conditions.
They used another term.
Creative will.
It sounds kind of like juche, but
thank you. That was what I was getting at. I'm sorry. Yes, this is a little bit. To my understanding, I could be wrong, but to my understanding, Marxism-Leninism predicates itself on the idea that you are shaped exclusively by your environment, that you cannot supersede material conditions, and juche is the opposite in the sense of that material conditions that mankind can use his own creative will to supersede them, and that he can be a master of his material conditions entirely, as mankind is how do I say, or that juche is a perfect philosophy of the working class. That was what, from what I understand.
I think it's probably closer to what Engels laid out in the Dialectics of Nature, that we will become masters of nature. And maybe at that point, what you were saying could be true, but I think that it's so far off into the future that I'm not sure how it would exactly happen.
Thank you, comrade. General Secretary Joe, did you want to respond as well?
I think Marxist-Leninist view is that there would be a dialectical relationship between man and his environment. The view that man is just a passive subject, or I should say not man, but humankind is a passive subject of the environment, I think would be considered mechanistic or mechanical and not dialectical. I think already within Marxism-Leninism, there's the view that man has, or humankind has, this sort of ability to shape its environment, even though that is conditioned by the existing environment itself.
Thank you, Comrade Joe. Okay, go ahead, Dr. D'Angelo.
But basically, it's a scientific philosophy that says man is the center of the universe. That's really what it comes down to. That man, and not a supernatural being, controls things. That's what this is all about. It's part of the what we call the French Enlightenment period, which comes way before the Enlightenment period, which puts down the church and says we should be secular. Comes from that philosophical background. That's all.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo.
Okay. Yeah, so I just wanted to ask a bit of a question here. I agree totally that socialism, by definition, to me, the lowest bar of that is communal ownership of means of production. But at the same time, my assumption on this always was that we're talking about advanced capitalist nations. So if there were ever to be a revolution here in the United States, we could convert immediately to that because we're already overproducing. But in a nation where 70, 80, 90% of the population was living under, let's say, feudal conditions, those people would need to build up, right, modes of production under capitalism. and that so that a sort of state capitalism would be needed so that you could have a nation that was, let's say, run by a socialist or communist party, but where the mode of production was largely capitalistic until production was, built up enough to fully kind of shift over into socialism. And in my thought, from my readings, that's a main part of what Leninism actually was or is, as opposed to classical Marxism. Am I wrong in thinking that?
Certainly. Yeah, there's a couple of things that I wanted to respond to.
Go ahead.
Yeah. It's like anything else. There's a time and a place for when we are able to, or any nation is able to overthrow the existing economy, period. So it's not a case of, is it highly advanced? There's all different situations. For the Paris Commune, they did not have the masses behind them, period. In the revolution in 1917, the whole Red Army was done with war, and the mass movement was there so that when Lenin says we are now going to nationalize the means of production, everybody said yes, and they didn't have to worry about the capitalists until they went into the Civil War. So I think, again, it's like we always say, it depends on the situation. But the other thing I wanted to mention to him when he was talking about free will is that if you notice what Engels said, that the consensus, once we were relieved of all this exploitation, so on and so forth, they were looking at it as a community, a free will community. Because we have to be careful that we don't say take on free will as individualistic. We'll all have free will and we will all work on that assumption. I think that's really important to point out. So that was all I was wanted to say.
Thank you, comrade.
Understanding on the mistakes of the Paris Commune, it was not the masses did not support much the same with the Finnish Revolution. Their scope was parochial, and they didn't confiscate the property of their class enemy, which allowed the bank to extend a loan to the French army after they were already defeated to continue to fund the government to march back into the capital. In addition to that, this is also why Germany, they bargained over I'm going to say it's the Rhine in exchange for help with putting down the rebellion. Initially, the state forces were defeated, but because they were not on the advance, they essentially allowed for the opposition to regroup and crush them. It had less to do with how unpopular or popular they were. It had a lot more to do with the structure and tactics of the revolutionaries and their organization. And on the nature question, I think tackled it pretty well. I would like to add that on man's relationship with nature, we of course make the environments we live in, right? Houses don't exist in nature. Dike, I live on a river. My ability to live in Jeffersonville is based on the Corps of Engineers maintaining dikes and flood walls and barrier devices up and down the river, so I don't flood every single time it rains. Which is what happened in 1937. Basically, half of Jeffersonville just went down the river. Which in turn, which in turn, the locks, which help make the inner river system navigable, also, interfere with the development of fishing populations, which is why they have to install these fish ladders. And one of the most polluted rivers in America right now is the Ohio, which reduces the people's ability to enjoy the Ohio. My analogy is getting too strung out, so I'll leave it right.
Thank you. Comrade Angelo, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was around in the 70s when the big thing was to take a little from this economic system, to take a little from a different economic system, put it together, and you create another type of economic system. Well, Lenin had that in his day too. And he said, there's a quote, "There is no third way. You're either a socialist or you're capitalist. There's no third way." And many people tried to do that. Yugoslavia, if you remember, was in the third way. They had private industry and they had state industry together. In the United States, people were saying, well, we're really socialist. We have a welfare system. We have Social Security. The post office is all. That's not socialism. That's why this class is important. We have to know what it is. You are either pregnant or you're not pregnant. You cannot be both in the middle. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo.
Earlier, like Dr. Angelo mentioned, moving from a system centered on a deity to one centered around humans. Like, what was he referring to? Was that Marxism or Enlightenment philosophy? What was he referring to again?
I believe Dr. Angelo was referring to French Enlightenment philosophy, correct?
Okay. Oh,
correct. Yes.
Thanks.
All right. With that, we will move on to our next section. Comrade, can I have you read? Would that be okay, sir?
So this is section 4. What can American do with socialism? All right. With our huge modern factories or mechanically skilled youth in the American natural turn for inventiveness, we have the greatest productive plant and workforce in the world. But our economic system condemns them to the most wasteful, unplanned usage and to periods of widespread idleness. To be free from the specter of unemployment and to be able to make proper use of the tremendous working talent of the American people would result in an enormous increase of production of every kind of necessity and luxury, enriching the life of the whole population. Why can't we have the right to work in America today under capitalism? Because capitalism can't provide it. It can't provide it. And because capitalism needs its reserve army of unemployed so that it can keep down the wages of the workers and hold over their heads the threat of unemployment to dampen their struggle. So in Article 119 of the Constitution of the USSR says, quote, "Citizens of the USSR have the right to rest and leisure. The right to rest and leisure is ensured by the reduction of the working day to 7 hours for the overwhelming majority of the workers, the institution of annual vacations with full pay for workers and employees, and the provision of a wide network of sanatoria, rest homes, and clubs for the accommodation of the working people." Imagine how working people in America who work in many industries at such a rate that they are, quote, too old at 40 could make use of that right, or huge, wonderful country, or national parks, or facilities for travel, the tremendous love of sports, and athletics among the American people, and the widespread of growing love of music, art, and every form of culture. Why can't we have the right to rest and leisure under capitalism? Because this would not give capitalism its full opportunity to squeeze the greatest possible profits out of its workers. Because capitalism can keep its workers in operation on thousands of dangerous, unhealthy, and incredibly exhausting jobs, only through the constant menace of imminent starvation and misery if the workers quits his job. In Article 120 says, quote, citizens of the USSR have the right to maintenance in old age and also in case of sickness or loss of capacity to work. For many years now, America has seen a succession of Townsend plans, ham and eggs plans, and whatnot that have enlisted hundreds of thousands in the hope of securing a decent and dignified life in old age, free from dependence upon others. Why can't we have this right under capitalism? For one thing, because under capitalism, life insurance is one of the biggest profit-making private monopolies. To quote from a little pamphlet, is socialism the answer? Quote is, throughout the period between the First World War and the Second, millions of people in Canada and the United States must have read this widely published advertisement, which is the future. It says, what happens to 100 average men of 25 upon reaching the age of 65? Only one will be wealthy, 4 will be well-to-do and able to enjoy comfort and recreation. 5 will be working for a living with no prospects of relief from drudgery. 35 will have died, in many cases, leaving families enduring hardships. 55 will be dependent upon friends or relatives or charity. These figures were worked out from insurance tables by the National City Bank of New York, the richest bank in the country. Could there be penned by any critic of capitalism an indictment more damning than that? And that was Irvine, Is Socialism the Answer? Page 21.
Thank you, comrade. With that, we'll go to our final discussion round. If you have a question or a comment, please use the raise hand function and we will get to you in the order they go up. Just as a note on this pamphlet, we did have to cut some stuff out, but they also have another section on education as well as just the right itself for women's rights and equality for all citizens as well. And they then quote articles number 122, 123, and I believe 121 of the Constitution of the USSR, which is all citizens have the right to an education. 122 is women in the USSR are accorded equal rights with men in all spheres of economic, state, cultural, social, and political life. And then 123 states equality of rights of citizens of the USSR, irrespective of their nationality or race, in all spheres of economic, state, cultural, social, and political life is an indefensible law. Any direct or indirect limitation of these rights, or, conversely, any establishment of direct or indirect privileges for citizens on accounts of their race or nationality, as well as any propagation of racial or national exclusiveness or hatred and contempt, shall be punished by the law.
My understanding is also in the Constitution, they prohibited anti-Semitism, right?
Yes, and that was part under Article 123 as well. And in fact, anti-Semitism and even like anti-black racism was punishable by law.
Yeah, and so my question, and this is, this was written in 1954, right?
47, 1940.
40s. Oh, even, wow. So, okay, sure, they were coming out of the Second World War, but my understanding is there was a lot more equality than there is today when you compare like wealth disparity. maybe they mentioned a fact that was like something I found unbelievable. How many did they say would be dead by the age of 60? It was like 55 out of the 100. Something.
55 would have been dependent on friends relative to
Oh,
charity. It was 35.
35.
And I'm pretty sure possibly today you would still have that one would be wealthy, but you would probably not have those four that are able to do well.
Right. And maybe in some respect, maybe people are living longer, even poorer people are living longer than 60 years. I don't know. I'm just curious if people have those facts because I would like to see an updated version of it. But that was unbelievable. That's all.
Thank you. Comrade Angelo, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think what tonight's class is telling us is that you cannot pick and choose, what we call cherry picking. You heard of this? I'll take a little from this, I'll take a little from that. And that's my definition of socialism. It doesn't work that way. Socialism is socialism. If you agree with it, that's good. If you don't, that's okay too. But don't try to make socialism something that it's not. In 1981, somebody in Staten Island in my club, a hippie kind of guy, you know, the hippies, we said, "What is socialism to you?" I'll never forget this. This guy was a pot smoker from way back then, loved to drink beer. Socialism is do your own thing. Can you imagine that? That's what his real definition of socialism was. Do your own thing. So we cannot make up definitions that we want it to be. It is you're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. You cannot be both. And I think that's important. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo. To answer earlier question, there is a website called 100people.org that's more on a global scale, and their statistics are for 2023, but I can post it in the chat if anyone is curious. But they state, let's see, 50 would be female, 50 would be male, 25 would be children, 75 would be adults, 10 of whom would be 65 and older. 87 would be able to read and write, 13 would not, 39 would have a college degree, 66 would be active internet users, 78 would have adequate shelter to shelter them from wind and rain, but 22 would not. 11 would be undernourished, 29 would be moderately or severely food insecure. 92 would have access to safe drinking water. 8 people would have no clean, safe water to drink. And it doesn't really break down economics too much, more demographic stuff, but perhaps you might find some interesting things in that.
Besides Schrodinger's pregnancy, the current senior poverty rate is 10.5% according to the U.S. government, which probably a little low. I'd say a good chunk of homeless people I see are in their 60s. I forgot my point. I'll leave it as is.
All right. Thank you. Any other questions or comments before we go to our wrap-up session? And so this class was based on a book we have at New Outlook Publishers. We will have a slide about that, but if you wish to read the entire selection, you can find it at newoutlookpublishers.store as well. You can also find it on leninists.org, which is our online archive of Marxism and Leninism works. So with that, we will go to our wrap-up. New Outlook Publishers is our sister publishing house, and for an update on that, I will turn the floor over to Comrade Scott.
Thank you. And it's YouTube podcast now. It used to be a Google podcast. Please visit our partner publishing house, New Outlook Publishers. You can find a lot of great works there, especially this. This is a very excellent yet short pamphlet We put it out towards the end of last year. Check it out. It's a great work. And of course, our latest release was Historical Materialism by Maurice Cornforth. And you can find a lot of great works and volume works from New Outlook Publishers that help support the school. So check that out. Once again, that's newoutlookpublishers.store.
And with that, we will go to the International for our close-up.
We want a condescending savior